We'll begin with a quote from Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle. Pierre Klossowski writes, quote, "The thought of the eternal return of the same came to Nietzsche as an abrupt awakening in the midst of a Stimmung, a certain tonality of the soul. Initially confused with this Stimmung, it gradually emerged as a thought. Nonetheless, it preserved the character of a revelation as a sudden unveiling. But what is the function of forgetting in this revelation? More specifically, is not forgetting the source as well as the indispensable condition, not only for the revelation of the eternal return, but also for the sudden transformation of the identity of the person to whom it is revealed. Forgetting thus conceals eternal becoming and the absorption of all identities and being. Is there not an antinomy implicit in Nietzsche's lived experience between the revealed content and the teaching of this content as an ethical doctrine in the formula, act as though you had to relive your life innumerable times, and will to relive it innumerable times, for in one way or another you must recommence and relive it? The imperative proposition supplements the necessary forgetting by invoking the will to power. The second proposition foresees the necessity concealed in this forgetting. Anamnesis coincides with the revelation of the return. How could the return not bring back forgetfulness? Not only do I learn that I, Nietzsche, have been brought back to the crucial moment in which the eternity of the circle culminates, the moment in which the truth of its necessary return is revealed to me, but at the same time I learn that I was other than I am now for having forgotten this truth, and thus I will become another by learning it. Will I change again, and once more forget that I will necessarily change during an eternity, until I relearn this revelation anew? The emphasis must be placed on the loss of a given identity. The death of God, the God who guarantees the identity of the responsible self, opens up the soul to all its possible identities, already apprehended in the various Stimmungen of the Nietzschean soul. The revelation of the eternal return brings about, as necessity, the successive realizations of all possible identities. At bottom, every name of history is I. In the end, Dionysus and the crucified. In Nietzsche, the death of God corresponds to a Stimmung in the same way as does the ecstatic moment of the eternal return." End quote. There are many implications and interpretations of the eternal return of the same. Here in this passage, Klossowski describes the aspect which he believes is the most significant, and which he thinks explains the relationship between Nietzsche's psychology and the doctrine of the eternal return. Nietzsche's entire career involves that critique of that idea that the ego consciousness is the autonomous governor of the self. He denied that our conscious intentions were effective, and argued instead that they are a reactive force, subordinate to the active forces of the body, which are instincts. Nietzsche speaks of the active forces with various terms, the drives, the impulses, the unconscious, and he puts forward this subversive idea that thought itself is an objectivation of a fluctuating intensity of impulses. Thought, therefore, follows after instinct rather than the other way around. And Nietzsche attempted to understand the great philosophers by inquiring what instinct is operative in his thought. What is the ruling impulse behind this given philosopher's thought, whether it be Kant or Spinoza or Schopenhauer or whoever else? Klossowski says that Nietzsche wished, perhaps paradoxically, to use the language of philosophy, which always lauds the rational world of the intellect. He wished to use that language in order to uplift instead the instincts. In Nietzsche's judgment, the conscious personality is an imagined continuity imposed on this discontinuous series of mental and emotional states. And really, they're only ever flickering memories at every moment that the continuity is imagined. That's the only raw material we have to work with. We extrapolate that flickering memory into this continuity of the self. But to call that continuity imagined amounts to a complete dissolution of the intelligible in Nietzsche's philosophy. And Klossowski argues that this mirrors Nietzsche's own moods, insofar as he felt that his migraines and his fits of illness were a kind of reprieve from the burden of his thought. that Nietzsche came to identify more with his strong nervous system than with the moral, conscious, or intentional agent, the self as we normally conceive of it, the responsible person, if we were to put it in moral terms. He declares that his whole philosophy is aimed at dismantling this notion of moral responsibility, and that's why he sides with the unconscious, as the unconscious is that for which we are not responsible. And the result is that in a war within himself, between his body and his mind, Nietzsche takes sides with the body. He sides with the somatic against the spiritual and hopes to aid and abet his impulses and the dissolution, the attack upon his conscious personality. And so Klossowski draws a connection that most interpreters of Nietzsche had not made. Nietzsche's multifarious view of the human being as a chance occurrence of drives or impulses, a discontinuity upon which a false coherence is imposed, these ideas are deeply related to the eternal return. Oftentimes, what is stressed in the eternal return is the remembering aspect. And what I mean by that is that in imagining the eternal return, we entertain the notion that one's life has been lived an infinite number of times, and we entertain the notion of remembering an infinite number of lives. Rather, we entertain the notion of re-remembering it. And obviously, we could not actually truly remember an infinite number of self-same lives, but I would argue that usually when people find themselves disturbed by the eternal return, it's that type of thought, the repetition imagined as though it could be remembered, if that makes sense. That's the form that the thought takes, and that's why they find it disturbing. But for Klossowski, he focuses on the centrality of forgetting. And we shouldn't forget how important forgetting was for Nietzsche. He says that forgetting is a healthy and active force. It's the rule for life rather than the exception. Memory is the exception. And Nietzsche asserts in The Genealogy of Morals that an inability to forget, a derangement in the capacity for forgetting, would amount to almost a pathological condition. So Nietzsche values forgetting, and forgetting is demanded by the eternal return. We would have to forget our self-same life every time it is relived, because we're not born into the world remembering any such thing. Klossowski writes, quote, "If I meditate on this high tonality in which the circle is suddenly reflected, I will see that it is impossible for it to have not already appeared to me innumerable times. But I had forgotten it, because it is inscribed in the very essence of the circular movement which I necessarily forget from one state to the next. The revelation did not come to me as a reminiscence, nor as an experience of déjà vu. Everything would stop for me if I remembered a previous identical revelation, even if I were to continually proclaim the necessity of the return, for it would serve to keep me within myself, and thus outside the truth that I am teaching. It was therefore necessary for me to forget this revelation in order for it to be true." End quote. So in other words, the eternal return is a revelation of this circuit that you're on, a circuit of discontinuous states, and one of those states is the state of remembering the revelation of the eternal return. And if at that moment you actually remembering it in the past, then that would keep you within yourself, and you would be unable to convey the truth of the circuit, because you would then be anchored in that moment in a kind of way, and would no longer be moving in this circular motion of the eternal return. Further, by remembering the thought of the eternal return, supposing it were to have an effect on your outlook, Nietzsche says this thought would make you other than you are. This is how he puts it in the greatest way, depending on the translation. It would change you, or perhaps crush you. And therefore, the remarkable thing about the eternal return is that it splits the history of our life in twain. It establishes itself as a definitive moment, nevertheless one which is always forgotten, but in which we can look back to the one who does not know of the eternal return, all those discontinuous states that had not experienced this revelation, and then the one who does in the future, and who must either then will such a truth or not will it. And we might think of how Nietzsche says his doctrine will break the history of humanity in two, the period before and after it is taught. That the same must be said of the individual who encounters this idea. Such a person, upon willing the eternal return, wishing it to be true, will no longer experience himself as an irreversible piece of fate, but as a fortuitous occurrence in the play of chance. It was the wonderful fortune of being able to will the eternal return. But then further, we must realize that our own experience of the return, the thought of the vicious circle, and the feeling we have toward it doesn't endure but changes like all of these discontinuous states. The mood of the return, the tonality of the thought, whether or not we have the will to countenance this thought, does not remain the same at all times. And it should be said that even if you don't believe in, Nietzsche's notion of the multifarious self, of the self as a series of discontinuous states, even if you believe in the rational ego consciousness as a kind of simple reality that of who you feel that you are or something like that, well, nevertheless, you still have to admit that this changes from early childhood to your youth, to young adulthood, to middle age, to old age, and so on. And I personally feel that the person I was 10 years ago is an entirely different person from who I am now. And I think the same could be said of myself 20 years ago. And then as I imagine into the future and project myself into the future, I imagine a similar thing will be true 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And to the extent that we are conscious of our various moods and the different wills that these moods may possess, we realize, I think, upon admitting that we will pass through a whole series, we might say, of selves, and the eternal return within that revelation is that we realize we'll pass through the entire circuit again and again. So, in other words, pretty much every view of the self has to account for some kind of discontinuity, the fact that there's some sort of change or progress in your life, but by bending the story of our life into this circular pattern, it can no longer, the coherence that you might have with a progression from youth to maturity into old age or something like that, that coherence even breaks down as well. So Klossowski writes, quote, "But to re-will oneself as a fortuitous moment is to renounce being oneself once and for all. For it is not once and for all that I had renounced being myself and had to will this renunciation, and I am not even this fortuitous moment once and for all, so long as I have to re-will this moment one more time. For nothing? For myself. Nothing here is the circle once and for all. It is a sign of everything that has happened, for everything that is happening, and for everything that will ever happen in the world." End quote. Importantly, the eternal return arrives with a certain mood. Stimmung is German for mood, but as Klossowski calls it, it's like a tonality of the soul. We might remember Nietzsche's supposition that one could analyze the tones in a musical composition and the intervals and progression of the tones to decipher the affects in the musician's soul that signify themselves in its writing, which drive or impulses becoming effective at every given moment in the composition. And then he says we might one day be able to read philosophy in the same way. So the eternal return comes to Nietzsche, in fact, as a hohe Stimmung, the highest tonality of the soul. Nietzsche experiences it as his highest thought. What does that mean? Well, he thinks the thought in coincidence with the feeling of the highest intensity, and that's part of why the eternal return was so important to Nietzsche. In a way, he's always trying to refer back to this intense feeling. In a way, you might say he's perhaps trying to recapture the feeling with a thought. And really, the eternal return comes to signify for him that highest of high feelings, even though the thought that was formed in the midst of the feeling doesn't always seem to conjure the same mood, or even the same enthusiasm in Nietzsche. And once again, I would argue that Klossowski is really only just taking Nietzsche's own methods and using them against him, because this is precisely how Nietzsche thought the creation of the word concept proceeded. That what begins as an expression of intense feeling is given an image and then converted into a sort of a representation, we might say. And we discussed a lot of that last time. It's also something you can look further into in the essay on Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense. But we could apply that absolutely to the eternal return, that it's just a representation of a high feeling. But something even more interesting happens when we continue that logic of Nietzsche's method and apply it within the doctrine of the eternal return. If we bring it to our minds as a truth, then this complicates the picture further, because it means that our moods, the whole series of states that comprise our lives, they're nothing other than this eternally repeating sequence. But we can't even distill any meaning out of that sequence, because the representations that we create about every point in the circuit are in fact just discharges of strong moods. So it truly does reduce everything down to just a circular, discontinuous series of moods. And so the individual is truly a multiple subjects, but now in an even more radical sense, in that it's just a series of unrelated experiences, we might say. And they never go anywhere. They never develop. They never proceed towards any end or goal, because in the vicious circle there is no beginning and no end. There is no point anywhere on the circuit where you can say, this is where it begins, this is where it ends. Klossowski brings up that passage in Zarathustra entitled The Vision and the Riddle, in which there is a parable of, quote, two opposed paths, coming together under the arch of a gateway on whose pediment is inscribed moment. The two opposed paths are one, but an eternity separates them. Individuals, things, events go up one path and come down the other and return the same under the gateway of the moment, having made a tour of eternity. Whoever stops in this gateway is alone capable of grasping the circular structure of eternal time. End quote. And I just think the vision and the riddle is such a beautiful metaphor, a visual image of this circular structure of time, what it really means. We might call to mind the conception of the world that was put forward by Heraclitus, that the world is an ever-living fire. The world was not made by any god nor man. It has no beginning, and it has no end. It has always existed, it always will exist, and the fire is kindled in some places and snuffed out in others. In other words, we might say we have memory in some places, we have representation in some places, high feeling, and then these flickering memories are sort of interspersed with silences. And so if you stand under the threshold marked moment, so from the present moment, you could proceed into the past for an eternity or into the future for an eternity, but both are the same path. In other words, if you head up the path, it will take you an infinite amount of time to loop back, to come back around to the current moment again, and vice versa. If you were to go down the path and go, I guess, infinitely back through the past, after an infinite amount of time, you would curl back around and then come back, I guess, in reverse time down from the road up into the future, right? Having made a tour of eternity, as Klossowski puts it. So no beginning and no end, except insofar as the one thing that could serve as both a beginning and an end is this single instance that we call the moment. That is really our only point of departure in either direction, and we don't actually experience an infinite progression through time. We can only pitch our imagination down the future path or the pathway that leads back into the past. And aside from Heraclitus, there's another reference I'd like to bring in, and that would be Ralph Waldo Emerson. Nietzsche is echoing Emerson in the sentiment that every name throughout history is mine. Emerson was a very big influence on Nietzsche, especially during this time in his life. But every name in history is mine because all I, quote-unquote, am is just this very circuit. The only way to posit an identity outside of the circuit would be by identifying with precisely this moment in which you perceive the reality of the circuit. But of course, that moment or that consciousness attained in that moment or that will attained in that moment will eventually be forgotten and disappear. And so the circuit ultimately remains the determining reality, something like that. Klossowski writes, quote, "By embracing in a single glance the necessity of the return as a universal law, I de-actualize my present self in order to will myself and all the other selves whose entire series must be passed through so that, in accordance with the circular movement, I once again become what I am at the moment I discover the law of the eternal return." End quote. So again, even in seizing on that identity, even in holding on to the self that recognizes the moment, that recognizes the eternal return, the thought itself contains forgetting, it contains anamnesis, and so you necessarily must will the entire sequence to repeat again. And so, to recapitulate, the eternal return is experienced as a profound thought by Nietzsche because it's formed during this high emotional intensity. It's precisely what we would expect it to be according to Nietzsche's own method, a revelation about Nietzsche, because in this meaninglessness, the goallessness, intentionlessness, the beginningless and endlessness of the eternal return, the only thing that remains of the self is a circuitous series of moods. Quote, up to now, in the everyday context, thought was always referred back to me in the designation myself. But what becomes of my coherence at that degree of intensity where thought ceases to refer back to me in the designation myself and instead invents a sign by which it would designate its own coherence with itself? If this sign is no longer my own thought, does it not signify my exclusion from all possible coherence? End quote. This is why Nietzsche saw the states within himself as akin to the waves crashing on the shore off the coast of Genoa in a passage in the Gay Science entitled Will and Wave. So the will is comparable in its form, if we might be so vulgar as to invoke form, to the image of the waves. Nietzsche writes, quote, how greedily this wave approaches, as if it were after something. I know you and your secret. I know your kind. You and I, are we not of one kind? End quote. And that's Nietzsche speaking to the waves in that last sentence. These forces, these shapes that arise and soar toward the heights, crash into the depths, pushing, surging as though they were after something, and then sort of dissolving back into the ocean. And Nietzsche compares that to the will. So the eternal return doctrine has the funny effect of affirming Nietzsche's dissolution of the coherent, moral, and responsible self. There is no coherence, no story from beginning to end. There is no morality because there's no end that can be reached. And there's no responsibility because one's fate can't be changed. It's eternal and ever relived. It's just successive waves, successive wills. Even the act of willing the eternal return cannot be the quote-unquote point of existence or its purpose, because, quote, to re-will myself one more time indicates that nothing ever succeeds in getting constituted in a single meaning once and for all. The circle opens me to inanity and encloses me in the following alternative. Either everything returns because nothing has ever had any meaning whatsoever, or else nothing has ever had a meaning except through the return of all things without beginning or end, end quote. So, the love of fate that Nietzsche demands has a very new sense to it in light of Klossowski's meditations on the return. The importance of amor fati, the love of fate, which we could really define as the willingness to will the eternal return, something like that, is that one has to will the non-willed. What does that mean? It's that having gotten rid of these notions of responsibility or of moral agency over the determination of what the self will be, whatever we're even going to call the self at this point. All we have is, again, a sort of an irreversible series of affairs. We might say that the discontinuity that we experience, the series of circuitous moods, is not of our own choosing or of our own making, not of our own will. And the incredible act of alchemy of the eternal return to will this once more and innumerable times more is to say, all of those things which I had no hand in willing, that have come to be through no act of my agency, is now a thing that I will. And this is a way of getting out of the potentially disempowering view of reality that one could be led to as a result of Nietzsche's presentation of the human being as something like an automaton. Back to Klossowski, quote, Zarathustra considers the will as being enslaved to the irreversibility of time. The will projects its powerlessness on time, and in this way gives time its irreversible character. The will cannot reverse the flow of time, the non-willed that time established as an accomplished fact. This produces in the will the spirit of revenge against the unchangeable, and a belief in the punitive aspect of existence. Zarathustra's remedy is to re-will the non-willed, inasmuch as he desired to assume the accomplished fact himself, thereby rendering it unaccomplished, by re-willing it innumerable times. Such a ruse removes the once-and-for-all character from the event. This is the subterfuge that the experience of Sils Maria, which is in itself unintelligible, first offers to reflection. This reflection consequently hinges on willing. End quote. So, again, to recapitulate, the past is irreversible. The will cannot exercise its power against the past. And so, insofar as the past is something that we not only do not will, but might actually will the opposite of that past, this fosters the spirit of revenge. Remember that ressentiment is precisely feeling in place of action. The situation is that there's no action that can be taken to remedy, quote unquote, the irreversible. There's no way for the will to change the unchangeable. And so the solution is to re-will the non-willed. And this can never be an accomplished fact, again, because of the forgetting that always returns within the circle. Nothing is ever complete, nothing is ever finally accomplished, because the once and for all character of all events is undone in some sense by the eternal return. Which, again, is sort of like the other side of the coin of, Heidegger's proposition that the eternal return is the way to stamp becoming with the character of being, insofar as every fleeting event is something eternal. And that's something I certainly agree with, but I also agree with Klossowski because he's presenting the other side of that coin. Everything that becomes is eternal, quote unquote, and that it will become again, but it will also pass away again. It will also have to arise again. Every state of affairs does not endure, but must again be, whatever is accomplished must always be reaccomplished. Whatever is done must always be redone, so nothing is ever finished. So in a way, it's the eternality of becoming and being. It is truly the unification of both, because in a way, it's the fleetingness of all things. It's the impermanence of all things. That returns too. So too with the remembering being the other side of the coin from forgetting. The forgetting returns too. And so this is the fundamental unintelligibility of the experience, because it makes everything fleeting eternal, yes, but it also makes everything eternal fleeting. Everything has already been accomplished and will be for all time, and yet nothing is ever finally accomplished, which is the opposite of eternity. The once and for all is actually impossible, and yet the eternal return makes everything once and for all. And really, there's no way to square this circle within conventional logic. And this unintelligibility of the experience, as willing as the fulcrum of the entire idea, this harkens back to that antinomy that Klossowski spoke of in the first section that we considered today, that the imperative proposition to act in accord with the truth of the eternal return, act as though you will have to relive your life innumerable times, well, that becomes somewhat nonsensical given the ever-returning forgetting. That imperative can never be accomplished because we've dispensed with a coherent subject that endures throughout the entire life, that persists even over the course of your self-same life. But it also obviates the need to re-will one's life as a kind of imperative, because you'll forget in any case. And this is one of Klossowski's persistent critiques throughout this book. As a doctrine, you're never going to be able to make sense of Nietzsche's eternal return and the implications of it, because it is ultimately unintelligible. We can only make sense of it as a kind of feeling, as a kind of orientation towards life, as a Stimmung, a hohe Stimmung, the highest tonality, because it is ultimately part of this overthrow of the regime of the conscious and rational that we talked about in the previous episode. And therefore it can never produce a totally coherent and rational doctrine. It's in fact, the dissolution of all such doctrines. That's what's at the root of all this, and that's why I wanted to spend so much time on the semiotic of impulses in the previous episode. But Klossowski does quote a note contemporaneous with the gay science that reveals the character of the Stimmung that Nietzsche attempts to communicate, what the feeling of re-willing the non-willing means in terms of a mood. Quote, "My doctrine teaches, live in such a way that you must desire to live again. This is your duty. You will live again in any case. He for whom striving procures the highest feeling, let him strive. He for whom repose procures the highest feeling, let him rest. He for whom belonging, following, and obeying procures the highest feeling, let him obey, provided that he becomes aware of what procures the highest feeling and that he shrinks back from nothing. Eternity depends on it." End quote. So we have a series of imperatives in this passage. But remember what Nietzsche has already said about imperatives. These are intense impulses, He presents it as a duty, he presents it as a doctrine, but ultimately it's a doctrine of finding your highest feeling and shrinking back from nothing in order to procure that feeling. And his concern is that each type, each person, discovers a way of becoming satisfied with their life, their way of life. This is a enduring theme in Book 4 of The Gay Science especially. And once again, there's no moral determination about which type of feeling or which type of activity produced in the pursuit of that feeling is the best, because this entire project is, once again, the attempt to dissolve these moral regimes, which attempt to lay down one set of feelings, one set of habits, one set of mores, once and for all. But the contradiction, of course, the unintelligibility, is that Nietzsche can't very well lay down his own doctrine as a moral imperative, once and for all. How can he say that once and for all the highest goal ought to be to procure the highest feeling? How can he say that it's your duty to find your own sun, as he puts it in The Gay Science? He imagines there are many antipodes upon the moral earth, many possible suns that someone might find, many ways of justifying their way of life. In a way, he's saying it's your absolute duty to be a moral relativist, to find your own truth, regardless of what the quote-unquote objective truth might be. And furthermore, at other times, Nietzsche does attempt to produce a selective principle by which certain ways of life are indeed set above others. And we'll discuss the use of the eternal return as a selective principle in a moment. But before we do, there's a really important nuance to this that we have to contend with, in the same way that consciousness and unconsciousness are in fact misnomers, and that it was a false dichotomy according to Nietzsche, as Klossowski interprets Nietzsche anyway, so too with the notions of what is willed versus what is non-willed. And why would that be? Well, because, quote, if all things return according to the law of the vicious circle, then all voluntary action is equivalent to a real non-action, or all conscious non-action is equivalent to an illusory action. At the level of conscious decision, not to act corresponds to the inanity of the individual will. It expresses the intensity of the highest tonality of the soul as much as does the decision to pursue an action. End quote. And it would be helpful, I think, to consult Heidegger to understand what Klossowski is getting at here, particularly his lectures on Nietzsche and what he has to say about the will to power. And the way Heidegger sees it, and I agree with him, is that it's the will to power is a critique of Schopenhauer's will to live. It represents an attempt to break the monism of the will down into something consisting of many non-identical things, these many perhaps constituent parts that are not equal to one another. And that might be surprising if you only know Nietzsche as a philosopher of the will to power, but Heidegger argues that the significance of the phrase will to power is to elucidate the element of power in all willing and the element of willing in all power. What power means is not pre-established, but determined by the will that wills it. And what will means is, again, it's more or less synonymous with power. It requires a conception of power in order for any concept of willing to become sensical. The significance of the will to power is not to suggest that there's some thing, quote unquote, called the will to power, some force or essence of human action that is behind all the different types of human action. Rather, the will to power, by definition, makes the meaning of willing multiple. As Nietzsche writes, will is only a word, and a word behind which a popular prejudice lurks. Or as Zarathustra says, I laugh at your free will and your unfree will too, to those who know there is no will. Maybe we could even put this another way. The difference between the way the term will was previously used versus the way Nietzsche uses it could be explained by analogy to the difference between the self conceived of as ego consciousness or soul versus the self as a chance occurrence of impulses. In traditional terms, will refers to conscious decision-making. The very intentionality that Nietzsche denies is a traditional part of the concept. What we will, in common parlance, is what we desire, or what we intend. But Nietzsche's view of the self suggests, no, what wills within us is this multiplicity of non-identical things, and they're aimed at contradictory desires. They have contradictory goals. And our conscious intention is like a narrative that we craft after one impulse or another has won out in the struggle between them, or perhaps it's a sort of post hoc imposed coherence upon the self as a weaving together or synthesis of the aims of the various drives. So when Nietzsche writes about the will to power, he doesn't mean the will in the traditional sense of the word, the way we might talk about conscious decision making. What will consists of is precisely this series of disunited states, prompted by different chance combinations of impulse, which last for a temporary duration, sometimes produce certain actions, then give way to another chance discontinuous state, like wave after wave crashing against the beach at Genoa. Thus we can say that every force is a quanta of will to power, but that nowhere will you find the quote-unquote will outside of the concept of it that we think into existence. And so even though Nietzsche's project with the eternal return involves this whole idea of willing the non-willed, the idea of the eternal return is also part of an attempt to dissolve the will. Nietzsche says in a note quoted by Klossowski, quote, "My consummation of fatalism, 1. Through the eternal return and pre-existence, 2. Through the liquidation of the concept of will," end quote. And another note quoted right afterward, quote, "The incessant metamorphosis. In a brief interval of time, you must pass through several individual states. Incessant combat is the means," end quote. And toward the end of the chapter, Klossowski gives a summary that serves as a wonderful comment on these passages from Nietzsche, and I think ties together all of these considerations so far. I think will help you make sense of all of this together. Quote, "Nietzsche does not say that the thought of the eternal return and the pre-existence it presupposes can itself bring fatalism to an end. He says, in the second place, that it is because the concept of the will has been eliminated that his fatalism is complete. If the thought of the eternal return in its various extensions already abolishes the identity of the self, along with the traditional concept of the will, then Nietzsche, under the second aspect of his fatalism, would seem to be alluding to his own physiology. According to the latter, there is no will that is not a will to power, and in this regard the will is nothing other than the primordial impulse. No moral interpretations by the intellect could ever suspend the innumerable metamorphoses this impulse lives through, the shapes it adopts, or the pretexts that provoke them, whether it be an invoked goal or the meaning that this impulse in its various metamorphoses, or even at the level of consciousness, claims to give itself. In this way, fatalism would be merged with the impulsive force that exceeds the agent's will and already modifies it, thereby threatening its stable identity." End quote. So, after experiencing this highest feeling and this highest lucidity, which paradoxically makes dust and nonsense of all conscious meaning, what happens next? Well, all feelings are fleeting and only the thought remains, the sign. And it seems that the initial thing that occupies Nietzsche's attention is the prospect of establishing the eternal return as a scientific reality. There are, of course, also paradoxes lurking in the background of Nietzsche's thought, unresolved antinomies concerning the eternal return that we will consider in a moment. But if Nietzsche can find some sort of scientific justification for the eternal return, then this will not only sanction the lucidity he has found by giving it the seal of like a scientific reality, it will also serve to make this highest thought persist, in that most real of forms, really. It will become a material fact, as real to us in modern times as gods and spirits were to the ancients. And this is where the divergence between the initial experience and the return as a doctrine begins to make itself felt. The longer the interval between the experience and the thinking that Nietzsche does about the experience, his continued reflection on the idea of the return, the more the thought diverges from the experience, from the tonality. A scientific proof may have seemed to him to be a way to hold on to the eternal return. But this is problematic from the start. Klossowski writes, quote, "As a hypothesis, the thought was suspect. It borrowed the means for developing the evidence, in itself undemonstrable, of the revelatory ecstasy from the schema of metamorphosis and pre-existence, both of which are implicit in the condition of the return. In this form, which requires belief, the return would be an instance of what Lou Salome called religious prophetism. And Nietzsche himself said to Overbeck, quote, "It is true only if believed to be true," end quote, a truthfulness that merely concerned the consequences of its repercussion as a doctrine. But in Nietzsche's mind, it had not yet achieved a doctrinal form. The secret experience remained an experience, whose only evidence lay in its intensity, end quote. The statement that the eternal return only needs to be believed to be true shows that Nietzsche's thought, even at this point, was already entertaining the possibility of using the eternal return, again as a kind of selective principle, a principle that could bring about transformation or metamorphosis of the individual or perhaps whole cultures. But the important thing is the transformation, not the truth or falsity of the idea. But what does Nietzsche have as evidence other than an intense feeling, what we might call a revelation? How does this experience of the eternal return not collapse into a kind of religious claim? And arguably that's exactly what it is, by the way. I mean, Lou Salome says that when Nietzsche confided the belief to her, she recognized his aspiration of proving the doctrine scientifically as a kind of misstep for this very reason, that it definitely has a more religious character, and she didn't think he was going to find the proof that he wanted. And Klossowski argues that Nietzsche's approach therefore diverges into two distinct approaches. On the one hand, he produces this dithyrambic novel, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in which the scientific framing of the eternal return is pretty much entirely absent. But obviously Zarathustra didn't put the issue to rest for Nietzsche, because he continued to write and think about the return for years afterwards. And what consumed him in the period following this was this persistent ambition to produce a magnum opus. And Klossowski draws upon several fragments, including those in The Will to Power, which were intended for this opus, which offer attempted proofs of the eternal return. For example, that there can be no final or definite state for the universe to reach, because given an infinite amount of time, the universe must have reached that state already. And yet we still experience change and transformation and impermanence, meaning that the universe has not reached a final state. Change must be the rule, must be the nature of existence, and there's no equilibrium at which it's aimed. This is just one example that Klossowski cites 4 of them in the text, and we've talked about these in the episodes on the eternal return. But it's Nietzsche philosophizing in the domain of physics and attempting to demonstrate that the world as it appears necessitates the return. Only in his circular structure of eternal time would it make sense for there to be no equilibrium ever reached. An infinite amount of time has passed, but it always loops back into itself, so it's never expended. And I should say that even though it seems like we're probably going very in-depth with a lot of this, going deep into the weeds, I'm still glossing over quite a bit in this chapter. In spite of how long I'm going to spend talking about this book, there's a great deal that we can't cover in any depth because there's just so much here. What will be helpful to remember at this point will be to consider what was driving Nietzsche. And it relates back to the idea of the phantasm, the image produced by the impulses, based on trace excitations, something that attracts or repulses the organism that's then made into a representation. And Klossowski argues that the eternal return is essentially and initially just this. It is a phantasm. It's a representation of that excitation, the high tonality of the soul, which left traces then in Nietzsche's psyche. And the phantasm is, again, it's different from the tonality itself. The attempts at a scientific validation are Nietzsche chasing the phantasm in a way. And as these attempts fail to bear fruit, what Nietzsche will turn towards later is the eternal return as a simulacrum. Particularly once it becomes a doctrine of selection imparted to the very few, Klossowski alleges, quote, "The secret of the vicious circle can also be regarded as an invented simulacrum, in accordance with one of Nietzsche's phantasms," end quote. And Klossowski wonders if what is happening here is that the eternal return simply merges with the will to power almost completely. Again, in this reading, will to power is the description of the behavior of forces in the world. It's moving, dynamic, and multiple. In other words, will to power from the perspective of physics. Quote, The eternal return lies at the origin of the rises and falls of intensity to which it reduces intention. One is conceived of as the return of power, that is to say, as a series of disruptions of equilibrium. The question then arises of knowing whether, in Nietzsche's thought, the return is simply a pure metaphor for the will to power. End quote. And we might also consider the relationship between the will to truth and the will to power in Nietzsche's work. The eternal return, as Klossowski argues, makes knowledge impossible, at least as an ends, because it denies all ends. If knowledge can be anything, then it can be only a mere means. The will to power, similarly, if considered as a world explanation, reduces the will to truth as a mere means, as an indirect expression of the will to power. Consciousness is an error in the total economy of life. The organic is the exception in the inorganic universe. The will to truth is an exceptional form of the will to power. And so this perhaps misguided project of Nietzsche's to create a form of scientific knowledge that would reflect the eternal return ends up leading Nietzsche to yet another interpretation of it. Again, the question is what the doctrine will do for the quote-unquote taming and breeding of mankind. Klossowski writes, quote, "Power must be given a goal, and thus must set free a meaning in order to overcome the absurd movement of the eternal return, so that this absurdity will not give force a pretext to disorganize nihilism. Once the will to power is given a goal, once it requires a meaning, once our futures hold new tasks in store for us, the thought of thoughts, the eternal return, singularly changes nature." End quote. We concluded the last episode with Klossowski commenting on a note of Nietzsche's in which he says that nature wants to overcome her greatest obstacle, and Nietzsche suggests that the eternal return is the overcoming of that obstacle. And I'll quote from Klossowski here as to what he thinks the obstacle is, quote, "On the one hand, forgetfulness and unconsciousness are necessary to life. On the other hand, there is a will to unconsciousness, which precisely because it is willed implies the consciousness of our conditioned state, an irresoluble antinomy." End quote. So in the 6th chapter on the eternal return as a selective principle, Klossowski goes into this problem in more detail. It's precisely the problem of lucidity itself as it presents itself to Nietzsche. The nature of the eternal return and the revelation of it involve this alternation between lucidity and unconsciousness, between the destruction of the will that has to occur in that lucidity and the naive state of mind in which one believes in the autonomy of his thoughts and thus believes in the illusion of goal and meaning and so on and so forth. Nietzsche is aware of this problem. As Klossowski says, it is irresoluble, at least by logical means. Klossowski writes, quote, "How can lucidity ever be possible? The only conceivable lucidity would be to admit our state of servitude, but even to sustain this level of lucidity requires a constant effort that liberates us from ourselves as well as from nature. This means we are aware of our mechanism. We must dismantle it. But to dismantle it is also to make use of its parts in order to reconstruct it, and thus to lead nature toward our own goal. But whenever we reason in this manner, we are once again masking the impulse that is driving us. It is true that we obtain something we have interpreted as willed, but this is simply nature, which, without willing anything, has realized itself for other ends." End quote. And Nietzsche writes, quote, "If no goal resides in the whole of human destinies, then one must be inserted into it, assuming that a goal is necessary for us, and on the other hand, that the illusion of an imminent end has become transparent to us. A goal is necessary for us because a will is necessary for us, our dorsal spine. The will as a compensation for belief, for the representation of a divine will, which offers something to our invention." End quote. Back to Klossowski, quote, "But to give a meaning and a goal to existence, what would this amount to? To nothing, insofar as existence, under the guise of human destinies, invents meanings and goals by itself, through individuals and societies. Nietzsche himself was divided between two different perspectives, even though he attempted to present them as a unique and coherent decision. On the one hand, the eternal return is the way in which the universe explicates itself. On the other hand, the nihilism that history has led to requires a revaluation of values, which will institute criteria for a new selection of the species." End quote. So, in other words, if we allow the thought of the eternal return to take hold and reveal the true existence of the self and the will, these are revealed as a non existence. There's nowhere you can go from the eternal return. The ring of return just leads you back to where you are. And yet, if we return to the initial problem, right, remember the initial impetus for Nietzsche's philosophizing. It involves the combat with culture. Nietzsche's suspicion that the entirety of human culture is based on a contradiction. The modern form of culture is going to destroy the older form, and so weakness and gregarious values are going to prevail unless there is some intervention. And I think it is at least arguable that Klossowski is correct here, that there is no impetus for such an intervention if one remains purely within the thought of the eternal return. And yet Nietzsche still seeks a meaning and a goal for existence in spite of the fact that these things would seem to be dissolved in the circle. And this is the revaluation of values. That's the form that his project of looking for a meaning and a goal for existence takes to combat the nihilism of history. Now, I have advanced arguments for synthesizing these apparently paradoxical notions in Nietzsche's thought, as has Martin Heidegger, in this interpretation, the interpretation that they can be coherent or synthesized. What the eternal return is really concerned with is that project of stamping, becoming with the character of being, eternalizing the fleeting world of phenomena. And you can look to the way Nietzsche talks about the overman. It's actually the eternal return of the overman, the faith that if the overman is ever to come, he will also be another sort of eternal truth, or the coming of the overman will be an eternal truth. And that's a way of dealing with the problem of the last man, of the smallest man, the smallness of mankind, is that the overman will too recur eternally. But what Klossowski does by pushing Nietzsche's unorthodox understanding of the self to new limits, I think that perhaps he's sharpened the contradiction between the eternal return, and we might also put on the side of the eternal return amor fati, versus the overman and the revaluation of values. And we must understand that if the eternal return is to be used as a principle of selection, that would mean that Nietzsche is subordinating the eternal return to the revaluation. Because in that case, the eternal return would be, after all, just a quote-unquote thought experiment, a means of testing how well-disposed to life one really is. And that's often how I have presented it in the past, but I guess Klossowski's argument would be that subsumes the eternal return into the revaluation. It makes it a tool of the revaluation rather than a doctrine about reality. And I would point out that however problematic that might be for Nietzsche's position, this element has been there from the very beginning, from the first aphorism in which the eternal return is ever mentioned, the greatest weight. Nietzsche raises the question of how well disposed towards life would you have to be to adopt it, as he says, your eternal confirmation and seal of your existence. This is all to say that Nietzsche can't really have it both ways from the perspective set down by Klossowski. Either we have to set down a meaning and goal, or we don't. Either the revaluation conscripts the eternal return into this project of setting a meaning, or the eternal return obviates the need for a revaluation because there's no need for a goal. So why does Nietzsche seek for such a thing in the face of this contradiction? And I think if we approach this as a rational question, the answer will forever escape us. Klossowski answers it by considering Nietzsche as an individuality, or as a personality, to try to understand Nietzsche's revaluation of values from the perspective of what need it fulfilled for him. And so perhaps this may seem unsatisfying, but there may be something to it. Klossowski's sense of things is that Nietzsche decided to make an attempt to produce some direction, effect some action, or posit a goal, because he sensed that he had only so much time left before the catastrophe would strike. And so he hoped to assimilate other consciousnesses to his own in order to escape his own coming destruction, and that therefore the eternal return became conscripted into that project. As a physiological story, maybe we could narrate it this way. Nietzsche has this intense high tonality of the soul, he forms the image of the circle, but then life goes on, and with the completion of Zarathustra, he suspects that he has not escaped a passive nihilism that he'd hoped to conquer, and he believes that at any time his life could end or he could lose his sanity. And so, for the reason of trying to escape from those fears, he attempts to create a legacy for himself. And that takes the form of escaping the passive nihilism, of overcoming it once and for all. Quote, "Did not the very experience of the eternal return bear witness in Nietzsche to what he himself had denounced as exhaustion? Was he or was he not a victim of what he called the most dangerous misunderstanding, namely that the symptoms of exhaustion would be confused with those of an excess or overabundance of life?" End quote. And further down he continues, quote, "Was it necessary to attribute to power the positing of a goal or the interpretation of a meaning? Or on the contrary, was not the very fact of believing in a goal or meaning a manifestation of pure impotence? Did not the greatest strength lie in living absurdly and affirming the value of life apart from any signification and goal? Why had the eternal return, which was experienced in a moment where all such questions disappeared, not subsist as such in his thought, as the thought of thoughts?" End quote. So the most dangerous misunderstanding is a phrase from one of Nietzsche's notes, and in that context, it refers to the fact that we have mistaken the most exhausted souls, the physiologies who are the weakest and most world-weary. We've mistaken them for being the richest and most overflowing souls. In other words, the saint, the ascetic, the holy man. The problem in the way that we have evaluated these types is in failing to perceive the distinction between health and morbidity. And that's what, again, Nietzsche believes is his special insight that grants him his wisdom, is precisely his perception into health or morbidity. But what if Nietzsche himself falls victim to this misunderstanding as regards himself? Again, that was Nietzsche's preoccupation. Are my thoughts coming from health or are they coming from sickness? Is the eternal return the expression of exhaustion, or is it an expression, is the search for a goal or meaning a manifestation of impotence? So, back to Klossowski, quote, "Since he is also questioning himself, it may be, and this is the underlying motif, that everything that he manages to think, and to think against the hitherto supreme values, is the result of a morbid state," end quote. And we've spoken of this before, that in a way it's one of the ways that you could put the problem of Socrates is that Socrates makes questionable the values that were previously held to be unquestionable, that there is something healthy about a conception of the sacred or a conception of the good in society not being subject to debate. And it's evidence not that Socrates himself went in and destroyed desacralized all of these things, but rather that it was precisely because Socrates ought to have been taken as a buffoon in any sane or healthy age anyway, that it's evidence that, in fact, the Greek society had already degenerated by the time Socrates got there, that when he raises these questions, he's successful in making questionable the traditional values of the Greek world. Now apply this on a micro scale, on the level of the individual. If Nietzsche is constantly subjecting himself to questioning, if he has this near obsession with distinguishing health from sickness, what does that say about the overall potential health or sickness of Nietzsche's beliefs? Has he not made himself questionable? Does this not show a sort of fear or insecurity about the strength or the health of his own thoughts? And Nietzsche attempts, in another note, for example, to suggest that sickliness itself is not passed on in the form of the physical inherited illness, but in the form of a morbid state of mind, which gives rise to these decadent moral values. So, in other words, he's doing a redefining here. The determination of health or sickness should be evaluated according to the values that the individual holds, because after all, isn't that the symptom? Isn't that the sign that reveals the physiology? But notice what Nietzsche's doing there. He's effectively flip-flopping on his position regarding the primacy of the body over the consciousness. Now we are to evaluate the body according to which values the consciousness expresses. And I'm reminded here of that classic, it's one of those philosophy webcomics where Nietzsche's attacking the philosophy of Plato as a sickly, weak thing. And then he meets the real life Plato, who was an Olympic wrestler, and he quickly gets Nietzsche in a headlock. And Nietzsche forces Nietzsche to admit that Plato has a strong philosophy and healthy ideas, something to that effect, right? But, and it's just funny because that is a real contradiction that you could argue that, Nietzsche would say, well, it's the values of Plato that were sick. But according to his own philosophy, shouldn't we be evaluating the values of Plato according to how healthy Plato was? How else could Nietzsche evaluate the values of Plato unless he sort of detaches them from the person and regards them in the abstract, right, as a sort of a rational consideration? Does this fit with health or sickness? Now, maybe Nietzsche can get away with this, given the collapse of the distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness, the reframing of all consciousness as just the objectivation of instinct. But I think Klossowski's insinuation here is at least fair. Nietzsche seems to be attempting to mentally stave off the suspicion that his thoughts are themselves the product of exhaustion, and this is why he seems so concerned with defining health and sickness in ways which do not actually refer back to the physiology itself, so there does seem to be another problem of unintelligibility here. So where does this leave us? Well, the thought of the return again is but a moment. Nietzsche subsequently rethinks it. He rethinks it many times. He re-wills it anew, under new tonalities of the soul. Now new impulses are attaching themselves to that same thought of the return. What is there to link these rethinkings, these rewillings to the initial experience, other than the sign itself, the concept that has been christened with this name of the eternal return? And I think it's important to refer to it as a sign rather than the thought itself, because the thought does not persist. Every time that it's rethought, you could say it has a new character to it, just like with any discontinuous state. So we shouldn't expect it to be persistent. So can Nietzsche really experience this moment and codify this concept and then rest in the revelation that he has received? Is that not in itself exhaustion? If his eternal return was to have such an effect as delivering Nietzsche into non-action, into passivity, should he not suspect that it is a sick doctrine? So it's precisely the fact that these discontinuous states do continue to arise, the fact that Nietzsche continues to move through the circuit, and that this movement is, you might say, living, something like that he's required to reappropriate his own doctrine again and again. There's another way we can think about this. One of the ways that Nietzsche describes the sickliness of traditional morality and religion is by pointing out its inculcation of impotence, the value of non-resistance, right? Remember, he says that the key to the whole gospel is that Christ says, resist not evil. And that's why Nietzsche says that Jesus isn't a heroic archetype, by the way, because the hero battles evil, whereas Jesus countenances evil. Or rather, he just denies this evil world. He denies it has any reality at all. The true reality is the kingdom of heaven. But this has the effect of producing non-action in reality, in the phenomenal reality. It produces a state of non-resistance to opposing forces. And this is precisely the thing that Nietzsche has always wished to avoid. And further, to make matters worse, quote, what he fears most is exactly what he sees deep in himself, a mutual antagonism of the passions, a multiplicity of souls in one breast, which points to internal ruin, end quote. So we might think of some of the passages where Nietzsche lauds the simplicity of the soul, having only one ruling passion, one triumphant virtue, or when he writes, quote, formula for our happiness, a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal, end quote. So not being pulled in multiple directions, but to have a straight line. And I suppose you could say that within the return, the straight line can't lead anywhere except back to the same position. And furthermore, when you take on that kind of world picture, it can produce that sense of non-resistance. That passage in Zarathustra where he lays down at noon and says, at this moment the world is perfect. There's nothing to do. I mean, this kind of attitude is almost indistinguishable from a new kind of Buddhism. Nietzsche often worried that a new form of European Buddhism would arise to deal with the current crisis of nihilism. So what can Nietzsche do? other than irrationally, unjustifiably make his own attempt at a goal. And there's a great quote that Klossowski sources to Nietzsche, but unfortunately, he has no citation for this quote. The book lists it as unsourced. But anyway, he attributes the following words to Nietzsche, quote, "As soon as we act practically, we have to follow the prejudices of our sentiments," end quote. And that is more or less what Nietzsche does, according to Klossowski. That in order to prove that he is not thinking out of exhaustion, out of sickliness, because he's got this concern with whether my thoughts are healthy or sick, he has to break out of passivity and thus act practically, and therefore all he can do, especially given his broader philosophy, is simply to act practically based on the prejudices of his sentiments. In other words, feelings over facts. And so the latter half of Nietzsche's philosophical career is thereby a kind of final attempt, a last burst of vigor, a declaration of perhaps once more unto the breach, dear friends. Quote, "He was fleeing the trial of his own metamorphosis. He was postponing its demonstration, a final experiment he would undertake and survive with his lucidity intact," end quote. And I think Klossowski is also arguably justified in this statement, insofar as Nietzsche gives us something of a mission statement to this effect in his notes. And I've quoted from this one before because it appears in Will to Power and concerns the revaluation and the attempt to combat the rising tide of nihilism, but we'll read it again here. Quote, "It is only late that one musters the courage for what one really knows. That I had hitherto been a thoroughgoing nihilist, I have admitted to myself only recently. The energy and nonchalance with which I advanced as a nihilist deceived me about this basic fact. When one moves toward a goal, it seems impossible that goallessness as such is the principle of our faith," end quote. And I don't think it could really be any clearer than this. Nietzsche is evaluating his past leading up to the project of the revaluation and saying that goallessness as such was his goal, even if he didn't realize it. He's effectively saddling his earlier period of his thought that was most preoccupied with the eternal return and the love of fate with the label of nihilism, in a sense. He's recognizing the conceptual frameworks that he created in the wake of this hohe Stimmung, this highest feeling, as nihilistic doctrines. Now, of course, they are not to remain as nihilistic doctrines. Both the eternal return and the amor fati will be, again, conscripted into this project of becoming selective principles and thus being taken up into the revaluation. But you could argue that there are different thoughts and different feelings behind these signs, even if he nevertheless uses the same sign. And Klossowski doesn't really talk about Dionysus as much, but Dionysus is similar in that the sign of Dionysus in Birth of Tragedy means something slightly different from the various iterations of the use of the term Dionysian throughout Nietzsche's work. There is, I think, a continuity, a coherence to it, but, Dionysian, when he uses the term Dionysian in Birth of Tragedy, he is looking at a historical phenomenon, whereas when the Dionysus that he brings up in Ecce Homo, that he sets against the crucified, has taken in all sorts of other meanings and all sorts of greater significance to just a historical force of the Greek, one of the two art forces of the Greek world. But so why, again, would eternal return be considered as a nihilistic doctrine? Well, because of all that we've discussed. The dissolution of beginning, end, meaning, goal, the will itself. What's needed now is the impetus for action if I'm to tackle this problem that has concerned me since my early days, the fate of culture, the nihilism contained in all values hitherto, the sickness contained in all values hitherto. And so Klossowski argues that the first interpretation of the eternal return is incommensurate with the interpretations of this later period. Quote, "Whenever Nietzsche considered the chances of a human type capable of acting counter to, or to the detriment of, the modern conditions of contemporary humanity, he was seeking means that could methodically reestablish the fortuitous conditions of the past that have favored some remarkable individuals. This project, which could not be more contradictory to the first interpretation of the eternal return, was derived from his physiological vision of the human being and from the conclusions he had drawn with respect to the ends of applied physiology. Through this kind of idiosyncratic Prometheanism, Nietzsche believed he could seize hold of and anticipate our own industrialized social apparatus. He had a premonition of it, but he feared it all the more in that he foresaw the methods of conditioning that would be able to be exploited by the social groupings, that in one way or another would maintain power. Which groupings? Once again, gregariousness would win out over single cases. Nietzsche's thought returned to his own criteria of health and morbidity, the gregarious and the singular, which were applied to examples from history and from the future that contemporary science promised to bring about. End quote. To take account of what has happened here, we've charted Nietzsche's thought as regards culture as a series, a psychological series of expressions that indicate his valetudinary states. These are states of mind in which one is concerned over their health. And Nietzsche is aware of this, that all philosophers have thought it is a question of the truth when it is just a question of themselves. Those are Nietzsche's words. And then he has the experience of the return, which appears to Nietzsche as lucidity, because it is the representation of one's own thought, indeed one's whole life, as just this series of discontinuous states in which knowledge, goal, and action become meaningless. And that is what Nietzsche had come to believe about the nature of philosophy, or indeed conscious thought itself, before the experience of the return. And that's why he experiences it as this lucidity, because it is an experience of one's own thought as just the epiphenomena of this circuit of discontinuous states. But in the aftermath, Nietzsche begins to see the non-action that this produces as evidence of exhaustion. He suspects that his newfound lucidity, perhaps lucidity itself, is exhaustion. And thus he resolves to produce action. So what does he do? Well, in full knowledge that his philosophy is only a question of himself, that he's only acting in accord with the prejudices of his own sentiments, he decides to consciously reverse engineer the trickery of what a philosopher does. The philosopher is always just interpreting his own states into his own criteria of the truth. So Nietzsche takes his notions of health and sickness and turns them into evaluative standards. But then where does that leave us? We began from the insight, more or less, that Nietzsche's own assessments of philosophy, history, and culture were objectivations of his impulses. Nietzsche now consciously takes what he understands to be his impulses and makes them into objectivations. So the only difference really is that Nietzsche is going to do what philosophers have always done unconsciously, lacking in lucidity, in the name of the gregarious norms thereby. Nietzsche is going to do it consciously, in full lucidity, and he's going to do it in the name of the singular case. Quote, "The simulacra are ours. Let us be the deceivers and embellishers of humanity." End quote. But what does this make Nietzsche? In Klossowski's terms, an impostor philosopher. And perhaps this is why Nietzsche would rather be called a fool than a saint or a buffoon. Why he includes these meditations on the mask and the falsification of the world involved in all artistic creation, careful to say that philosophy is also a kind of art. In his lucidity, he has exposed all philosophy as a confession, as a recapitulation to the instincts that are already predominant. Quote, "To create is to do violence to what exists. Creation ceases to be a game at the margins of reality. Henceforth, the creator will not reproduce, but will itself produce the real." End quote. And so what he's going to try to do is to attempt to create values anew against the values that already exist. And this has to be undertaken with a kind of deception. The philosophers in Nietzsche's vision are to become the new legislators of value, the new creators. But this would just serve to mystify the world once again, wouldn't it? If you attempt to compress these values, which are really just intense impulses, into eternal truths. Well, the answer again is a resounding yes. The point is a new mystification. Quote, Nietzsche is taking up an occult conception of political mystification and making it pass into the hands of the philosophers. According to this esoteric tradition, which goes back to the Sophists and passing through Friedrich II of Hohenstaufen, continues up through the encyclopedists, Voltaire and Sade, one demystifies only in order to mystify better. It is not simply a matter of destroying the notions of the true and the false. It also concerns the entrance of obscure forces onto the stage through the moral ruin of the intellect. What we see at work here is a positive notion of the false, which, as the basis of artistic creation, is now extended to every problem raised by existence. End quote. And perhaps to give a steel man for Nietzsche's deception, his new mystification of the world here, we might think of his comments on Schopenhauer and on philosophers in general in Twilight of Idols, where he says that whether one affirms life or rejects it, it's really just a question of instinct. Because a living man can't judge the value of life, he's an interested party, and a dead man can't do so either for other reasons. What is revealing here is the openness with which Nietzsche speaks of the fate of truth within his new psychological approach to philosophy. Like Schopenhauer denies life, whereas Nietzsche affirms it. But which position is true? Nietzsche openly says neither position is true. And as we all know from our if you've done any broader reading of Nietzsche, he thinks that the only question is whichever position is stronger. That's the consequence of making will to power the answer to every question of existence. But again, is will to power true, or is that Nietzsche's artistic creation? Is that an artful deception? And in fact, Nietzsche comes to see the simulacrum forming function of the impulses as evidence of their proper functioning. Your impulses should be giving you these phantasms, these images or representations or ideals. Quote, nothing exists apart from the impulses that are essentially generative of phantasms, end quote. So once again, it's a state of health to posit a goal. Even if from the absolute perspective, the lucid perspective, it is totally unjustifiable. And that is really the genius turn here. The will to truth does not permit you to affirm a completely personal and subjective experience, an intensity of impulse. It doesn't permit you to turn that into a moral or political standard. But if your evaluative judgments are not based on the will to truth, which again has been rendered nonsense within the vicious circle anyway, and you instead adopt will to power, health, strength, and so on as your standard, because again, you're just following your own sentiments, then you would actually see the irrational phantasm, the straight line, the goal, as it were, as a sanction that your overall physiology is healthy. The decline of health could in fact be known or recognized by the inability to produce such irrational goals. Nietzsche writes, quote, nihilism in the passive sense manifests itself as soon as the ability to invent new fictions and interpret them is exhausted, end quote. So understand that Nietzsche's vision of the philosopher of the future as a new type of creator and a legislator of morals is specifically not the philosopher that follows the will to truth, or the philosopher that extols the value of objective knowledge, or even one who believes that giving his teaching is the truth. He's giving the truth to people. This is why Nietzsche's philosopher of the future is a type that signifies a mix of the philosopher and artist, and we might think of Nietzsche's remarks in his lectures on the pre-Platonic philosophers, where he says, each of them does a pure form of philosophy because he does his philosophy as an artistic creation. He allows the total chord of existence to chime from his very being. And we might say that the pre-Platonics, Thales, Heraclitus, Empedocles, and so on, are naive versions of the philosopher-creator before the emergence of the dialectic as a way to truth. So they exist prior to this conception of objective truth, the domination of the will to truth as the highest value, all of which takes hold with Socrates and Plato. And Nietzsche wants to create a new form of post-truth philosophy, for lack of a better word, after this Socratic theoretical revolution has already taken place, to be able to recapture that creative mode of philosophical thought. But you could no longer do so from naivete, right? You would have to, at this point, after the theoretical approach of Socrates, you would have to be consciously aware of the fact that what you're doing was creating a reflection of the world, conditioned by your own impulses. You would have to know that what you were saying from the perspective of absolute truth is false, insofar as you're willing to just take your impulse and turn it into an evaluative standard or a judgment on society or something like that. And so, this is a real challenge because it's perhaps the reason why the theoretical age poses such a threat of nihilism, because it undermines the healthy functioning of the impulses in that they should normally be generating phantasms. They should be generating and interpreting new fictions. Now we somehow have to overcome this while being conscious of this fact. So we have to become deceivers, right? So what does the artistic activity of the philosopher of the future involve? Quote, to fix a goal, to give a meaning, not merely to orient living forces, but also to elicit new centers of forces. This is what the simulacrum does. A simulacrum of goal, a simulacrum of meaning, which must be invented. Invented from what? From the phantasms of the life of the drives. The impulse, as will to power, already being the first interpreter, end quote. The new philosopher will have to invent simulacra of goals, doctrines, meaning, and so on, from creatively arranging, rearranging, and selecting among the phantasms of the life of the drives. This could involve, for example, using the code of ordinary everyday signs in order to indicate things normally forbidden within the language of those signs. There are any number of ways that Nietzsche struggles with language that we've spoken about in the past on the podcast. But the key point for our purposes is that this is why the figure we're describing is a kind of impostor. He teaches not a philosophy, but a simulacrum of philosophy. He doesn't seek the truth, even if he speaks in the old language of truth. And since he's trying to reconstitute health and strength out of the material that he has available to him, comprised by the existing drives and impulses, he has to experiment. What does it mean to be an experimenter in this sense of the word? Well, Klossowski breaks down Nietzsche's understanding of science in a helpful way. Science contains two contradictory impulses, in that it involves this attempt to understand the quote-unquote real world, to understand the principles of reality, to follow the will to truth, but also to conserve the species and to benefit mankind, in other words, to gain power. These impulses are at odds with one another because the understanding of the real world produces this sphere of the extra-human. This is what our knowledge becomes. The world becomes a world of objects, a non-human world within which our human intellect is a mere chance occurrence, and the attributes of that intellect and its intentions and its motivated reasoning, its goals and its phantasms become obstacles to scientific knowledge. In other words, you may recognize this critique from much of Nietzsche's work, that when we create this notion of the objective truth, the Platonic form, the intelligible world that's so far removed from the world of phenomena and desire and feeling, motivation, and so on, we've essentially created this inhuman version of the truth and then placed it above humanity. But, quote, science in no way wishes to acknowledge that the species might itself be increasingly monopolized as an object by this initially extrahuman sphere, to the detriment of its psychic and moral security. The day human beings learn how to behave as phenomena devoid of intention, for every intention at the level of the human being always implies its own conservation, its continued existence, on that day, a new creature would declare the integrity of existence, end quote. And I think some of this may call to mind the dialectic of enlightenment, if you've heard that episode we've done or if you've read that book, and the way in which scientific rationalism renders the world as objects in order to manipulate said objects, but eventually thought itself becomes an object, or in this case, one's intentions, one's will, all of which is a part of thought. And so we might notice that this is precisely the thing that drove Nietzsche's own nihilism, the perceived goallessness as such of his world orientation, and which he now intends to repudiate in favor of this affirmative philosophy. This also exists in science. Science arrives there by a different road, but the state of exhaustion is the same. In other words, science aims at lucidity for the purposes of accomplishing its task, which is the betterment, the increased power of mankind. And yet, the means by which it pursues that end ultimately undermine that end, because then it ends up making humanity into an insignificant thing. It ends up exalting the extra-human realm beyond and above the human, and it begins to discount all of the, really the human stuff, our drives, our intentions, our passions that are the most important things in the world. And it's really the same thing with Nietzsche's project. He's seeking a kind of lucidity about what philosophers are really doing as part of this project of, it took the form of his Hellenizing period earlier, the somatic overthrowing the spiritual, the drives, the body overthrowing the regime of the consciousness, which is ultimately identified with a moral regime, a rational regime. But the lucidity that he receives in the sign of the vicious circle undercuts his entire project, the change that he's trying to effect. And so one might ask why Nietzsche was so concerned with the problem of science throughout his career. And I think here it becomes clear because he sees the problem of science in his own inquiry, even in his own project. And what happens in the end, the way Nietzsche sees it, for the fate of science, is that in so many words, it's the total victory of the gregarious impulse in human life. That's what results from it. Every human being becomes understood as a material object among objects. We might think of Dostoevsky's notes from Underground. Man is just a piano key. We just require certain inputs for continued existence. All of our goals, our intentions are just, again, it's that same problem that we described earlier in reducing the human being to an automaton. It's disempowering to the will. So, in what way is the philosopher creator or the impostor philosopher akin to a scientist then? Well, it's in that realm of experimentation in which the impostor philosopher allies himself wholly to the scientific impulse of advancing the species and abandons the will to knowledge entirely. It's essentially Nietzsche's form of experimentation is science breaking off its alliance with that force of objective truth and becoming solely a force of power. And thus, what brings the impostor philosopher together with the scientist is this, quote, limit point at which one's own intention of producing simulacra from the phantasms of the impulses coincides with the activity of the scientist, end quote. And we might wonder how far this experimentation can really go for Nietzsche. Because having discarded the reality principle, there's really no scientific postulate that's not fair game for experimentation. And Klossowski has a wonderful passage on this, and I think much of this your understanding will be bolstered by reading some of the passages in the Gay Science Book 3, where Nietzsche discusses these indispensable errors, the errors required by the human mind in order to comprehend the world. But nevertheless, he calls them errors because they're not found in the world. They're interpretations, in other words, that we impose on reality in order to make it comprehensible, to make it into something that we can use, that can aid in our survival or increase our power. But the world in itself, insofar as Nietzsche has a conception of such a thing, would be therefore negatively designated as chaos. And we say negatively designated because in the same sense in which you can't really attribute anything to the unconsciousness other than the fact that it is not conscious, because once you bring the unconsciousness into the consciousness, it's by definition no longer unconscious. Similarly, chaos is the world unpatterned by any human impositions of our useful errors. That said, Nietzsche does attempt, to the extent that he does give it a positive definition, you could say nothing other than quantities of force exist within the chaos. It is a world that is just as intentionless as the scientific world of objects. And yet, I would say that Nietzsche is avowedly or consciously he's projecting what is within himself, his world as will to power, again, as something that he's showing us in his mirror, as he says within that famous passage in The Will to Power. Again, like the pre-Platonic philosopher, allowing the world to resound with the total chord of existence to resound from out of himself as a kind of artistic act. So he's not really doing the same thing that Schopenhauer does when he claims to have overleapt the chasm between phenomena and noumena. by discovering the will as the thing in itself. But nevertheless, in conceiving of the world as this chaos, and then within this project of affirming the phantasms, including moral phantasms as symptoms of health, something normal, something desirable for our nervous system and our mental faculties of representation, Nietzsche is led to this somewhat paradoxical position. Klossowski writes, quote, "For science, chaos does not exist, any more, Nietzsche will say, than the species or the individual exists. Laws exist only because of our need to calculate. Only quantities of force exist. Chaos, then, is already nothing more than the term of a negative formulation that we establish on the basis of our own conditions of living. Chaos does not exist as an intention, and we cannot conceive of ourselves other than as intentional beings. Where does this impossibility come from? From the fact that the forces we improperly name chaos have no intention whatsoever. Nietzsche's unavowable project is to act without intention, the impossible morality. Now the total economy of this intentionless universe creates intentional beings. The species man is a creation of this kind, pure chance, in which the intensity of forces is inverted into intention, the work of morality. The function of the simulacrum is to lead human intention back to the intensity of forces which generate phantasms. This is not the function of science, which, denying intention, compensates for it in a beneficial and efficacious activity." End quote. So intentions are formed by an intentionless process. So are they really intentions, is the first thing we might have to ask. Is that not a misnomer? Well, we can no longer regard our intentions in the moral sense that we used to, in the sense of moral responsibility. Now they're the signifier of a healthy impulse. It's not the arbitrary decision of a moral agent. So Nietzsche creates a kind of intentionless morality, a morally irresponsible morality, whose goal is to lead intention back to the creation of vital intense forces. This is why we hit another wall of unintelligibility. This is why it's an impossible morality. Because we can again see the logic, so to speak, of all of this project as part of that war of the somatic versus the spiritual, and yet we can't very well act without intention. However we may undermine intention in our lucid philosophical critiques, however we may wish to lead intention back to those forces which produced it, which are themselves intentionless, this would seem to be impracticable in the highest degree, and also, if it were ever to be achieved, would seem to be a mark of sickness for Nietzsche. So, again, it's another one of those paradoxes that I think Klossowski is great at bringing to the forefront. But as we've said, everything is on the table in this new spirit of experimentation, every principle of reality, also every principle of morality. And so in the moral and in the political context, Nietzsche writes a number of notes that suggest that the experimenter, the philosopher of the future, must be willing to do immoral things. Because similarly, as science has broken off its relationship with this objective truth drive, it's also broken off its relationship with the moral drive, we might say in the gregarious sense. It's part of this moral project of going back to the intentionless, going back to health or sickness as just forces rather than moral quantities or something like that. But so the experimenter, the impostor philosopher, acts immorally from the perspective of the herd morality, but he's moral, quote unquote, from the standpoint of Nietzsche's intentionless morality. Nietzsche writes, quote, "To be capable of sacrificing innumerable beings in order to attain something with humanity, we must study the effective means by which a great man could be realized. Until now, every ethic has been infinitely limited and local, and blind and lying about surplus in the face of real laws. It existed to prevent certain actions, not to clarify them, and it was certainly unable to engender them. Science is a dangerous affair, and before we are persecuted because of it, we should stop speaking of its, quote, dignity," end quote. And so, to raise another paradoxical question, for what purpose are we experimenting? What is the goal? We've already spoken of goal in abstract terms. We might say it's the goal of health, the valorization of the singular case, the moral ruin of the intellect. But really what Nietzsche has been grasping towards is the need for a goal itself. To find a goal is his goal in the revaluation of values, in a sense. All of those other things, like he's following his sentiments, the prejudices of his sentiments, but it's because he needs a goal as such. because not to have one has signified exhaustion now in his system. And he wishes to accomplish something with humanity, to use humanity as his raw material, the impulses and phantasms of humanity, in order to produce something new, something that those impulses and phantasms haven't created before. And out of this, we get the articulation of that goal as the overman. Is this not a contradiction with the eternal return? Again, Heidegger would say no, Klossowski would say yes. And so I would caution my listeners not to simply come down on the side they reflexively agree with. Consider both perspectives in this regard. Klossowski's comments on this task bring out what he sees as the contradiction. He says that Nietzsche wants to introduce a justifying type as an arbitrary reproduction of a phantasm, but it only seems arbitrary from the perspective of the current human species. What is required is the drive to surpass the species as such. And every such surpassing always appears arbitrary from the perspective of that which is surpassed. Quote, "The postulate of the overman, which is not an individual but a state, is the means by which Nietzsche, who does not believe existence has a goal, will nonetheless give existence both a meaning and a goal to pursue. In this way, Nietzsche winds up substituting the creative initiative of the individual for the million random events of existence. In doing so, however, he is suppressing the crucial point of his thought, namely that these random events were implicit in the eternal return, which alone makes them succeed in producing something, independently of the willing or non-willing of humans. Though unable to forget his revelation, the only thing Nietzsche will retain from it in order to exploit it is its sign. Having passed beyond the reality principle, he immediately falls back on this side of the principle, re-establishing it through a voluntary reconstruction of the law of return by means of science." End quote. And that, I think, is a really powerful critique, one that colors much of the latter half of Klossowski's book, that the simulacrum formed of the eternal return becomes more important to Nietzsche's thought than the experience of it, that the pure lucidity of the experience and the meaninglessness that it conjures will essentially be forgotten. Instead, Nietzsche will exploit the vicious circle. That's part of this artful deception of the impostor philosopher. And how will he do this? Well, one of the ways that Nietzsche says that the masters of the earth will be determined is by their ability to affirm the eternal return. A doctrine is needed, he writes, that will enliven the strong and break and paralyze the world-weary. Klossowski writes that Nietzsche, quote, "remains attached to the necessity of a hidden action, which, in the name of the vicious circle, would induce despair in anyone who still lays claim to a gregarious consciousness." End quote. Elsewhere, Klossowski explains how the eternal return as a selective principle will function. Quote, "What now exists in a hidden manner will one day be manifest in an event, when the sign of the vicious circle will shine forth in the firmament of universal consciousness in all the brilliance of its absurdity and the absolute nonsense of existence, at which time it will be the exclusive task of the masters to determine not only the meaning but the course of all things. How will this event be brought about? There are two ways to foresee the constraint exerted by the thought of the vicious circle. Either the thought of the vicious circle will become so intolerable at this point that the weakest will destroy themselves, or else, since it is unlikely that despair will replace indifference, Nietzsche imagines that the experimenters under the sign of the vicious circle will undertake certain initiatives which will make life impossible for the refuse and will make the privileged incapable of revolting." End quote. And something that we're going to talk about in the episode subsequent to this one is Nietzsche's later emotional tone or tonality regarding the eternal return. Because if we are to believe Lou Salome and Franz Overbeck, when Nietzsche communicated this doctrine to them, he seemed almost frightened or disturbed by it. And we could imagine that he experienced a state of fright or disturbance when bringing the eternal return to his mind after the initial experience, and he imagined perhaps transmitting that disturbance to the entire populace. That it could become a test precisely because this thought is the greatest weight to have to bear. But why would it make the privileged incapable of revolt? Well, the eternal return from this perspective, from the instrumental perspective that Nietzsche intends to use it, establishes the master as master by his willingness to sanction life as it is, to sanction nature as it is, to affirm it once and innumerable times. In effect, the eternal return becomes a litmus test for whether one is able to not only acknowledge the reality of the current hierarchies, the realities of slavery, which is a human universal upon which all culture is based, according to Nietzsche, the reality of suffering and the ubiquity of suffering, and the need for sacrifice in the name of experimentation, actively to consent to all of this in order to be a participant in it. That is what is required if one is to attempt to find the conditions which produce the greatest individuals, and to bring them about consciously, lucidly, rather than by mere chance. Nature herself is willing to sacrifice. She's willing to make these squandering experiments. And so too, you who affirms nature must be willing to sacrifice if you want to be one of these masters of the earth. Nature imposes hierarchies. All of nature is will to power. You too must be willing to impose such hierarchies. Nature ordains that some will be masters and some will be slaves. This philosopher creator, or the philosopher deceiver, must be willing to be master and will that others be his slaves. And Klossowski, I think, correctly points out that if there is any social order envisioned by Nietzsche, it has nothing to do with a return to previous historical forms of hierarchy. He may draw upon these past hierarchies, but that's simply part of his attack, his maneuvering against the existing order. The social order already depends on slavery today, while obfuscating this fact. And Nietzsche sees how this rising industrial, utilitarian, bourgeois economy is appropriating all of mankind into its conscripted forces, turning as many human beings as possible into cogs in its machine of production. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Slavery, universally visible, though no one wants to admit it," end quote. Now, some may ask, isn't Nietzsche against all of that? The leveling of mankind, these values and the way that they do turn everyone equally into a slave? He does think that this would lead to an impoverished form of human life, but it also represents a force that could be harnessed, it could be used. If a species of universal slavery is being created, then all it needs is really a caste of masters to take advantage of that. Creativity and power have only ever been limited to a small sphere of people. And the problem with the modern culture is not that there are no slaves, but that we no longer produce masters. Even the bosses, the bankers, the military men, the presidents, they're all functions of the system. They don't articulate or enforce new values or conduct these grand experiments. They are just as bound by the gregarious values as everyone else. And so, as Klossowski says, Nietzsche is not a romantic dreamer rebelling against the current order. Rather, he imagines how this order can be used, how a creative philosopher could harness the existing forces for his own ends. He asks, quote, "Where are the masters for whom the slaves are working?" End quote. He's not really concerned with the fate of humanity considered in the abstract. For whatever that might mean, humanity in the abstract, but for the production of those singular cases, exceptional people who elevate the species and make it surpass itself, in them, in their example. And thus, this is the subterfuge or the conspiracy of the vicious circle as a selective doctrine. As philosophical deceivers, Nietzsche's future philosophers are not concerned with explicating their lucidity to the masses, but in remystifying the world. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Our nature must remain hidden, much like the Jesuits, who established a dictatorship in the midst of a universal anarchy, but who introduced themselves as a tool and a function. What is our function, our cloak of slavery, our teaching? Slavery must not be suppressed. It is necessary. We would simply like that such men for whom we are working always be formed, so that we do not waste this enormous mass of political and commercial forces." End quote. And Klossowski quotes from a number of sections of Nietzsche's work where he makes it very clear that he sees the economy as this force of universal enslavement. He more or less agrees in description with the Marxist view of capitalism and its exploitative character, and the fact that the workers are coerced into their positions in society. They're forced into it. It's not a voluntarist system. And that's why it makes so little sense to me when people compare Nietzsche with Ayn Rand, as many have done. There are certainly similarities there, but Nietzsche doesn't see the market as something ruled by voluntary exchange or as a place of individual achievement. He sees it as a place of, again, forces, of hierarchies dominating the use of some human beings for the benefit of others. Nietzsche writes, quote, "It is clear what I combat is economic optimism, as if increasing expenditure of everybody must necessarily involve the increasing welfare of everybody. The opposite seems to me to be the case. Expenditure of everybody amounts to a collective loss. Humanity is diminished, so one no longer knows what aim this tremendous process has served. An aim? A new aim? That is what humanity needs." End quote. Now, in Prescription, he obviously suggests a very different kind of sublation of this state of affairs than Marx does. A select few, perhaps a hidden group of, quote, masters who stand apart from the political and economic activities of the masses, harnessing them for their own experiments in scientific knowledge, experiments in moral values. He calls these his surplus men, sovereign people who are masters of themselves, who are, quote, maintained by this universal surplus labor, end quote. And he cautions them, quote, to leave the slaves of the world to their own ways of seeing and valuing, to leave them their illusions, and, quote, don't battle against opinions that constitute a remission for the slaves, end quote. The surplus people, the people who feed off the surplus of society, are in fact, quote, the meaning and the apology of all this fermentation, end quote. All right, so this picture of the conspiracy of the vicious circle that Klossowski has midwived from the thought of Nietzsche, it involves setting apart a small group of surplus men. They create the conditions for producing the, quote, rare and singular plants of the human race. They don't produce their greenhouses for bringing forth new exceptional types by theoretical planning, but by creative experimentation. This possibility, Klossowski argues, is, quote, impracticable if it were not the object of a vast conspiracy, end quote. But it is a conspiracy whose values are nevertheless already, quote, inscribed in and produced by the process of the economy, end quote. The goal is, to put it in grandiose terms, quote, planetary management, end quote, which means in this context to produce human beings, quote, whose attribute of sovereignty would be derived from its non-productive way of living in the context of a gregarious and hard-working totality, which amounts to a kind of sanctification of parasitism, end quote. What must be overcome to make this sanctification possible is the challenge posed by the modern values, the gregarious morality of this very industrial society. That's part of the reason for Nietzsche's war against ressentiment and the bad conscience. We live in a morality that values everything within the unconscious negatively. It values everything impulsive and instinctive negatively. Our animal nature is something to be repressed and conditioned, and ressentiment and bad conscience is all of a part of that. And so if we think about this in symbolic terms, doesn't Nietzsche's phantasm here, his goal, his image of the future he's trying to create through this conspiracy, resemble the overthrow of the conscious, rational, moral apparatus by the affects? That on a social level, he counters the, quote, vast enterprise of intimidating the affects, end quote, so that a moment can arise in which, quote, these rare, singular, and to be sure, poisonous plants can be clandestinely cultivated, and then can blossom forth like an insurrection of the affects against every virtue imperative, end quote. So he makes it very clear right there. These new masters of the earth, these secretive figures, are quite literally, on the macrocosmic scale, the rebellion of the affects against all these moral virtues and imperatives. And I want to take a step back at this point, and I think it's worth marveling at the genius of Klossowski in reversing the normal judgment that those with a critical reading of Nietzsche take as regards the relationship between his political project or his moral project, and Nietzsche's, say, descriptive project, his psychological project of describing the multiplicitous self and the primacy of drives over consciousness, and intention as following from impulse rather than the other way around, or anything like that. So usually, at least as I have encountered it, those who criticize Nietzsche's philosophy overall on the basis of disagreeing with his political project will attempt to suggest that his positions on the consciousness and the drives ought to be held as suspect because they are merely the means of justifying his political agenda. In other words, the political agenda is what Nietzsche really wants to do, and therefore he he creates this whole fake psychology that he tries to impose. But here Klossowski is really saying the opposite. Nietzsche's political agenda ought to be held as suspect because of the way that it mirrors his experience of his own drives and the war of the somatic versus the spiritual. That as an individual or as a subject, he took sides with his body, with his nervous system, against the intellect, against the responsible moral person, wishing for the dissolution of consciousness and the escape from intentionality and coherence. And as a political thinker, here he wishes for the insurrection of the passions against the rule of reason. And so the possibility that Klossowski raises is that that's actually the point. The political project is really a means to achieving, perhaps, even though Nietzsche completely exploits the vicious circle, even though he attempts to insert a meaning or a goal into existence, it's really just the difference between, say, active and passive nihilism. That he's trying to escape from the potential of passive nihilism created by the vicious circle, which has revealed the arbitrariness of all goals. And he says, well, nevertheless, let's create a goal. I want to become active. And the form of his activity, nevertheless, mirrors what's going on within himself, within his own body and his own mind. So is the political ideology actually the means to the end of, perhaps even unconsciously, it's Nietzsche's confession, is political ideology as another way of dissolving the conscious regime. And so the conscious regime of the self mirrors the rational regime of society, the rule of the gregarious morality promoted by apparently rationalistic and scientific and humanistic intentions. That regime, too, is just the objectivation of impulses, which are exactly as tyrannical and domineering as they ever were, which makes the moralizing about the current regime a kind of fiction, an illusion. And insofar as we are seduced by this illusion, we simply receive universal slavery but never reap anything from it. In order to do anything, to will anything, to become active, you have to break from that purely rational view of life and act according to an impulse that simply makes an arbitrary demand. And thus Nietzsche's view of the self is reflected again in the view of the political. But not only as regards the goal, right? It's not enough to simply make a new valuation. The phantasm functions only insofar as it attracts or repulses the organism, to the degree that the organism acts in accord with the valuation. We could even question if a valuation has even been made if it doesn't necessitate action. And so Nietzsche writes in an unpublished note that in contrast to the nihilists, quote, "It is the condition of strong spirits and wills. These do not find it possible to stop with the no of judgment. Their nature demands the no of the deed. The reduction to nothing by judgment is seconded by the reduction to nothing by hand." End quote. So when the nihilist says no to something, when he says no to life, it remains merely a judgment. And perhaps that's the true difference between passive and active nihilism. In the final analysis, the active nihilist is truly and finally motivated to action. And what he rejects, he actually destroys. And we mean physically destroys. And so when Nietzsche talks about these experiments as involving willingness to sacrifice countless human beings, he means that in a very real sense. So while Klossowski correctly, I think, points out that Nietzsche's view of the individual and free will and morality, they're not simply excuses for his political ideology. That would be a mistake. He also shows how the political ramifications of Nietzsche's encoding of his impulses into the political could involve outcomes that most of us would say are atrocities. Klossowski writes, quote, "If there is a representation of a conspiracy in Nietzsche's thought, it is one that in this regard is no longer content to simply level a judgment against existence. Thought must itself have the same effectiveness as what happens outside of it and without it." End quote. Now, as we come to the conclusion here, let us return to where we started in all of this, with the experience of the eternal return. I've already made the case Nietzsche's thought strayed very far from the initial experience, and Klossowski reiterates that point at the end of his analysis of the return as a political project, or indeed as a conspiracy, a conspiratorial project. Quote, "Through its experimental intent, the conspiracy seems to repudiate the very authenticity of the vicious circle. On the one hand, the meaninglessness of existence serves as an argument for the philosopher to free his hands and start pruning on the spot. On the other hand, the truth of the return is virtually renounced as a chimera and considered as a pure phantasm. Hence, it is the simulacrum of a doctrine, invoked by those who pursue the simulacrum of a goal, namely the overman. In effect, the overman must be identified with the vicious circle, and in this case, would be identified with a phantasm. For if the return were only a chimera in Nietzsche, then giving the history of the human species a goal and meaning, willing this goal, comprehending this meaning, would amount only to following the dictates of this second simulacrum of the overman. If it is true, on the contrary, that all things return in accordance with the vicious circle, then the proposed meaning and goal would be chimerical, and all the experiments would be merely an imposture. End quote. Further, he continues, quote, Nietzsche, as he writes to Overbeck and later to Strindberg, wants to break the history of humanity in two, as well as humanity itself. In the course of events, the eternal return as experience, as the thought of thoughts, constitutes the event that abolishes history. Nietzsche adopts the role of the evangelist. The kingdom is already among you. But what is among you? This is the bad or good news, is the vicious circle that leads to the superhuman. Nietzsche should have said the inhuman. End quote. And that's a nice encapsulation of the central contradiction as Klossowski sees it, as well as the criticism of the doctrine's outcomes. The end result is that Nietzsche does end up finding himself, for better or worse, among the religious, insofar as he's more like an evangelist, preaching the good news, the imminence of salvation, the goal to be reached in the future. All things are in the hands of God, and yet God requires you to do this. All things have already been written, but we have to work to bring forth this outcome. And thus, we might ask whether Nietzsche's affirmative philosophy ever escapes from the religious prophetism that Luce Salome accused him of. And to complicate matters further, if we are to call Nietzsche a prophet, or at least more similar to that type of prophet than to the ranks of scientists or philosophers or even artists, we must admit, for the record, that he's not, he doesn't have a bad track record as far as prophets go. In particular, Klossowski points out that many of Nietzsche's descriptions of where he sees the industrial economy proceeding read almost like they were written in the modern day. And they're exactly what has transpired. Zarathustra says as much, doesn't he? He preaches the vision of the overman, the image of the goal. And the people say, no, give us the last man instead. And who was the last man? We could describe him by reference to the industrialism which triumphs everywhere today. Quote, it is neither the triumph of singular cases, nor the triumph of the mediocre, but quite simply a new and totally amoral form of gregariousness, the sole agent left to define existence, not the superhuman, but the super-gregarious, the master of the earth. End quote. And so when it's all said and done, that it seems that the action Nietzsche wished to carry out has not been made manifest, and he predicted as much. Or perhaps the conspiracy is underway as we speak, but in secret. Whatever the case may be, Nietzsche would have been the first one to admit that, at the end of the day, it is unconscious, intentionless forces that are in contestation here, and his language of valorizing the affects, or valorizing the singular case, can't really be thought to have any effect on the outcome. And yet, for all of these contradictory impulses in Nietzsche, the thing I like best about Klossowski's work is that it presents these paradoxes with a strange kind of coherence. Even if we can never make sense of Nietzsche's project in the final analysis in rational terms, on the irrational terms of the self, in terms of the tonality of Nietzsche's soul, I think we can come to understand what was driving him. And in that respect, Klossowski presents a compelling narrative. That's all for this week, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Next time, we're going to get even deeper into the Klossowski's psychoanalytic angle on Nietzsche, and consider the most beautiful inventions of the sick. And here, by the sick, we mean Nietzsche himself. But we'll save that for next time. All right, everybody, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.